Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, and I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. Thank you for joining us for our San Diego Comic-Con at Home presentation. This is the Law, Judges on the Mandalorian. Our panelists today include Circuit Judge John B. Owens from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, U.S. Magistrate Judge Stacey Beckerman up in the District of Portland, and Judge Matthew Shrino, New York State Supreme Court criminal term in Brooklyn. Today, I share the moderating duties with Nari Ely, who is at the U.S. courts right now, and we're going to have a rip-roaring great time discussing The Mandalorian. Nari, can you walk us through the agenda we have for today?
Absolutely. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to do our best to get through it in a timely fashion because I anticipate some of these will definitely generate a fair amount of discussion. We're going to talk about bounty hunters. Of course, bounty hunting is a very prominent part of The Mandalorian, so we'll get into a little bit about what is the actual law around bounty hunters and separate some myth from fact there. And the next topic is one of the ones that at the Legal Geeks, at least, I know we got a lot of questions about, which is, what were there any legal issues here with Grogu eating the frog lady's eggs? Next, we're going to get into the hunting of dangerous beasts, in particular the mudhorn, and legal ramifications of the Mandalorian's activities there. We're also going to talk about duty to teach and whether Ahsoka had any duties that she perhaps neglected or pursued adequately for Grogu. We're also going to talk about using force to defend property. In particular, can you kill small desert-dwelling creatures when they threaten your property? We're also going to talk about whether or not droids have essentially the right not to be murdered, or are they simply property? And destruction of a droid is simply property destruction. And then finally, we're going to get into a little bit of the proper definition of the Imperial remnant and whether or not they have committed war crimes in the course of The Mandalorian.
Thank you, Nari. And for everyone, I know many of you do wonder, how is bounty hunting a complicated profession? Well, just as a preliminary matter here on Earth, bounty hunters in the United States do not do murder for hire. That's solicitation. They are not assassins in the United States because that violates all kinds of other laws and it makes it sound like a mob hit. The way bounty hunters work is they're referred to as bail bondsmen, in which they can go after someone who might have jumped bail, they were arrested, arraigned, they're out on bail, and they then don't show up at court. The bounty hunter can then go after them. We see that actually in the first episode of The Mandalorian with bail jumpers that Mando goes after and freezes in carbonite. So that is kind of a very true representation of what a bounty hunter could be without the convenience and the storage ability of putting people in carbonite. For our judges, some of you do preside over criminal cases. Have you encountered bounty hunters in your time on the bench? And Judge Shrino, since you predominantly are in criminal court, have you seen bounty hunters?
No. In New York, if the court issues a warrant, it's generally the warrant squad of the New York City Police Department that goes out and finds the people that have absconded and brings them back to us. We do get, when someone is out on a bail bond, the occasion where a bail bondsman will bring in the defendant before a warrant is issued and surrender them so that they can have the bail exonerated so that they're no longer on the hook for the bail. But we generally do not see the bail bondsman going out and getting the defendants and bringing them back. That's usually for our police department.
And I prefer that as a society, but that's just me. Judge Beckerman and Judge Owens, you both did time helping prosecute people as federal prosecutors. Did you encounter bounty hunters in any part of your legal careers? And we'll start with you, Judge Beckerman.
Yeah, I am happy to report that the answer is no. And that is in part because our district, the District of Oregon, doesn't use any form of bail. And as the debate rages on across the country about whether cash bail is a good idea or a bad idea, We could look to my district as a model because we don't require any type of bail or bond to be released from prison. The judge, myself, makes a determination if someone is dangerous or is a risk of non-appearance. And we make the determination on that basis whether they should be released from jail pending trial and not on their ability to post a bond or pay bail. So it's a good model, and I'd encourage people to look into it more.
Thank you. Judge Owens, in your career, have you seen bail bondsmen be put to use?
I have actually, and surprisingly, it was in a white collar case. It was a tax defendant with the last name of Corona, and he and his wife were out on bail. Both of them were kind of misbehaving on bail. And all of a sudden, one day I got a phone call in my office when I was a prosecutor, said, you need to get to court immediately. So I hustled down to court, and lo and behold, a bunch of guys were there, just like you see on TV, about 3-4 guys, and in some sort of handcuffs that the bounty hunters had was Mr. Corona. So yes, I have seen this happen. It's rare in federal court, but it still happens today, and they're still out there.
Wow, I was not expecting that. So that is 1 out of 3. So fantastic. Well, we see the catchphrase used twice in the first season of The Mandalorian. I can bring you in warm or bring you in cold. And the force is used to apprehend someone, but getting into lethal force, that is a very murky area because we don't like bounty hunters using lethal force. It's one thing if it turns into a self-defense situation, but as a general rule, no, they're not going to bring in anyone cold because that's not their purpose in life.
If I could chime in to agree with you, Josh, as far as I have been able to find in my research on this topic, the concept of wanted dead or alive is generally more myth than fact. And in fact, most of the most well-known bounty hunters in American folklore were in fact, the ones that are based on history, were in fact federal marshals that were out seeking wanted criminals.
Again, it's the stuff of Jesse James from a 10-year period in US history from the 1870s. And that was just a 10-year period of time. Well, let's pivot to another very entrenched legal doctrine, and that is as a common carrier. And Judge Shrino, looking to season 2, episode 2, The Passenger, we have the Mandalorian take the frog lady to Trask with a stopover on an ice planet. Did transporting this passenger turn the Razor Crest into a common carrier? Your thoughts, please.
Well, a common carrier is anyone who offers to the public to carry persons, property, or messages would be considered a common carrier. Now, in the case of Mondo, he's really not holding himself out as someone to carry passengers or property as a general proposition. That's not his role in life. This was more of a private contract to bring someone to a location. So a common carrier is more like a bus that's going to be making a regular route between A and B, whereas he's more of a contract hire. And what one of the important distinctions used to be with regards to common carriers is there was a common law duty of extraordinary care that was put on common carriers. And this dealt with from the old English law where a common carrier was almost like a bailment. Your job was to get the person from A to B. And if you failed in that job, in delivering that package or that person, you were liable for those damages. And New York and most of the modern states have now adopted basically the same level of negligence and a negligence rules, just like everyone else. So you still have to prove that the common carrier was negligent. It's not that automatic recovery. So the distinction doesn't matter as much today as it would have mattered where you would have wanted someone to be considered a common carrier so that there was that higher level of care.
So there was no duty to fight off the ice spiders, is what you're saying, or?
I think it would certainly not necessarily be considered negligent to have to other than preserving, one wanted to preserve their own life. And I think Mondo had a moral duty that he saw that he was going to complete the job, but it was not necessarily a reasonable, foreseeable occurrence that the ice spiders would have been part of this scenario.
Excellent. Well, let's pivot to the next topic, Nari.
So on to the question that I think got the most as the legal geeks, which of course, what was up with Grogu eating the frog lady's eggs? Now there's a host of, moral concerns, just gross feelings about this. But I think what we, as the legal geeks and as judges, should be asking ourselves is, what were the legal issues presented by Grogu's appetite? So Judge Beckerman, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, now anyone who watched season 2 cannot unsee Grogu eating the poor frog lady's egg babies. To the frog lady, of course, her eggs were the only hope of keeping her species alive, and Mando is tasked with transporting the eggs across the galaxy to ensure the frog people's survival. But to Grogu, of course, the eggs are a very tasty snack. So first, we examine the criminal law behind Grogu eating these eggs. Did he, in fact, murder the frog lady's eggs? Well, at least 38 states do have a fetal homicide law. And in most of those states, the law applies regardless of the stage of pregnancy, including the earliest stages. However, for those who watched the episode closely, you know that the frog lady was transporting the eggs to her husband so that her husband could fertilize the eggs. All of the fetal homicide laws require post-fertilization eggs. Verdict, not guilty, at least of fetal homicide. But a prosecutor may decide to charge Grogu with theft or grand theft, depending on the value of the eggs. But he's a baby, you say. You can't charge a baby with stealing someone else's snacks. Objection, though, Grogu is in fact 50 years old when The Mandalorian begins in 9 ABY, and not much older than that in season 2. So the theft verdict is probably guilty, grand theft Grogu.
And actually, I think this topic leads very well into the next one, which is, of course, you mentioned that these eggs might represent the last hope for the survival of the frog people. So this, of course, brings us to the Endangered Species Act and whether Mando has to answer for violations of that. I think most notably, we see just in the first season, second episode, a seemingly rare species that Mando makes a contract with the Jawas in order to retrieve an egg. We're talking, of course, about the mudhorn. And in the course of completing that contract, Mando ends up killing the mudhorn. So Judge Owens, do you think that presents any problems vis-a-vis the Endangered Species Act?
Well, I think so. I think a lot of people have been trying to figure out, how do we stop Mando? Perhaps we could prosecute him for the prison break. Maybe there are some tax consequences, because I don't think he's paying a lot of taxes on all these bounties he's collecting. I think the easiest way here is through the Endangered Species Act. I think it's dead bang winner for the whoever's in charge these days in the Mandalorian world. So as Nari mentioned, yes, Mando does make this contract with the Jawas to steal the egg in exchange for the parts from his ship that have been spread out, I guess, in the big sand crawler. And it's a pretty violent scene. I mean, one thing I will say about Mandalorian is they're not afraid to kill animals. And there's been a lot of people who have been concerned about that. And I understand why. This is the one where, with the help of Grogu, or at this point it's just called the child, sticks a knife into the neck of this great mudhorn and kills it. So the first question is the mudhorn an endangered species? I would assume yes. I don't think there are a lot of these running around. And the fact that the Jawas are so excited to have the egg, I think, explains it. So here on the screen are the elements. And so any person who knowingly takes, and takes means basically killing, or sells any species listed as endangered or threatened. I think killing the mudhorn is a straightforward violation. And that's one violation. I also think the egg, where he actually gives the eggs to the Jawas in exchange for the parts to his ship, that's a separate violation, because that's selling or delivering conceivably any part of the species. And so if you look at the penalties here, honestly, not a really big hit on Mando. That's probably one bounty. You could probably clear that. But so this is where, if you're an Imperial prosecutor, you got to get creative here. You got to think outside the box. And so what I would do if I were prosecuting Mando is I would actually charge him with conspiracy. And so, here we go. So even though a violation of the Endangered Species Act has, you saw, some relatively low penalties, a violation of 18 USC 371 has a 5-year maximum. Again, that's not going to be the sentence, but up to 5 years, and a fine of up to $250,000, and it's a felony. So why would you want to do this? First, you want to stick it to Mando, but second, you can go after those Jawas. The Jawas are a problem for everybody, right? They're always getting in the way. Here, you can rope them in a conspiracy because they clearly conspired with Mando to make this happen. And then you got two things. One, maybe you can lock up a bunch of Jawas, but two, you could get them to flip against Mando. And whoever else knows, the Jawas seem to know a little bit about everybody. So you could kind of move up the chain on this planet, on Tatooine. You might be able to do a lot of things. And so there could be even more charges. So I have to think Mando's in trouble. Killing the Mudhorn for the egg, which is like that gigantic Cadbury egg that they all start cheering, Suga, 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 when they get it. I think there's a real case here against Mando. I think he's in trouble.
And if I could just suggest also, Judge Owens, and I think Judge Beckerman, I heard from the grapevine that you might have a story about this as well related to this. Is there a difference? Is Mando potentially also in trouble when it comes to killing the crate dragon?
Yes, the crate dragon. And Judge Beckerman, please jump in here. I think the crate dragon is different in one respect. I think it's clearly endangered. Let's hope so. Let's hope there aren't a lot of those things running around, or that could be bad. But here, the killing of the crate dragon was not for the purpose of trafficking the good, in a sense. It was for the defense of this town, village, whatever you want to call that outpost that it was. So I think it's different. Now, you're going to find people who would say, well, you could have trapped it. You could have, maybe had a big net, pretty big net to do that. But I think it's different. But I don't know, Judge Beckerman, what do you think?
I agree with Judge Owens. And even if I didn't agree with Judge Owens, any opinion that I would write on the topic would be appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And so Judge Owens has the final word in any event.
All right, so I think that moves us right along to our next topic. Josh?
So the first live action appearance of Ahsoka Tano was celebrated across nerddom because, again, watching the Clone Wars for many years, everyone just was ecstatic to see a live action samurai type film on our small screens. But we raise an issue of, did she or did she not have a duty to take Grogu under her mentorship and custody and to train him? I want to get the thoughts of both Judge Sciarrino and Judge Beckerman on this, because there are two issues that are interwoven. And Judge Sciarrino, your thoughts first on this potential duty for Ahsoka to become the guardian of Grogu.
I can't see where there would be such a duty fostered on Ahsoka. Whereas, Grogu as a child, there's a duty of society to teach the child. Ahsoka is no longer a Jedi. She had already left the Jedi Order. Arguably, if she was still a Jedi, possibly as a former school participant, Grogu, there might be a duty on her to finish his schooling if she was within the leadership of the Jedi Order. But absent that, maybe a moral duty in that she understands the Force and could lead him on the way as to the Force. But absent that, I really cannot see where society would foster a duty on Ahsoka to take care of Grogu.
Well, let's pivot to the issue of teaching. Judge Beckerman, your thoughts, please, on whether or not there was a duty to teach.
Well, we can ask ourselves, can we force a teacher to teach our kids? And there's a lot of different legal issues involved. And one, of course, is the right to a public education without discrimination. So, for example, the California Constitution provides that all public schools must provide students with an educational environment that is safe and free of discrimination, regardless of the student's race or ethnicity or national origin or force sensitivity. So even if the child is from a different species, they still have a right to be educated, even if they do not necessarily speak the majority language, but instead only murmur and coo, they still have a right to be educated. But of course, Ahsoka Tano is not a public school teacher. Even if she was a private school teacher, you couldn't necessarily force her to teach your kid, so long as she is not discriminating against him because of who he is. A footnote right now, a lot of school districts are being sued for not holding school in light of the pandemic. Students are being, fed up with distance learning and want to be in the classroom and are trying to force teachers to teach them in person. Many of those lawsuits have failed. But of course, Ahsoka Tano is not a school. She's really more like a tutor, like a badass Jedi private tutor. And so did she have any legal duty, setting aside the moral or the ethical duties to teach Grogu? Did she have a legal duty? And I think the answer is no. I agree with Judge Chirino. Unless she was agreeing to train all other force-sensitive children except Grogu, and Grogu could prove that it was because of his race or his species, then she might be in trouble under Section 1981 of our civil rights laws, which prohibits racial discrimination in making contracts. That would be a problem. But here, obviously that was not the reason. Ahsoka had arguably legitimate reasons not to train Grogu, and that was Ahsoka's decision to make. So verdict, Ahsoka Tano.
And since you are our magistrate judge, let's talk about Magistrate Morgan Elsbeth while we're on the subject of magistrates and her having prisoners hanging, standing, getting electric shocks so you can see their skeletons. Just from a cruel and unusual punishment perspective, any problems with that?
Yes, definitely a lot of problems with that. Under our 8th Amendment to our Constitution, folks in custody deserve to be treated humanely. All types of prison conditions generate litigation, and it's a busy part of federal court dockets. But this one, not a close call.
Glad you feel that way. That's good. That's good. That was good. Well, Nari, can you take us to the next topic, please?
Absolutely. So as Judge Owens aptly pointed out, the Jawas have been a problem throughout the history of the Star Wars franchise. And, hearkening back to that season 1, episode 2, the child, there's an early in the episode, the Mandalorian returns to the Razorback only to find it being actively stripped for parts by Jawas and proceeds to shoot one of them. A shootout ensues, another Jawa or two die. And of course, our hero is victorious. But as lawyers, we must ask ourselves, was Mando within his legal rights to use lethal force against the Jawas? So Judge Owens, do you have any more thoughts about Jawas here?
I do. And look, if I'm Mando's lawyer, I got a case. I can make a case, but I think it's going to be a tough one. What is the law about using force in defense of property? So generally speaking, and there are a lot of exceptions to this, you cannot use lethal force to defend property. So for example, if I hear something outside, I go outside my house and I see someone trying to break into my car who's parked outside of my house, I do not have the right to shoot and kill that person. However, I do have the right to use non-lethal force to stop them from stealing my car. So for example, I could shove them, I could push them. That's generally, in most states, is okay. Now, if they pull a knife on me in response to the shove, then I am being threatened, my life is being threatened, then I actually can use lethal force. So you can see how a non-lethal force situation can turn into a lethal force situation pretty quickly. There are some exceptions to this entire doctrine. First, the state of Texas has very different laws. I won't get into that, but if you live in Texas, the laws there are different than, say, in California, where I live. Now, what are the general exceptions? One, a burglary situation, someone breaking into your home or your apartment. Many states allow lethal force to be used there, even though the breaking in itself is not necessarily going to be putting you in immediate threat of losing your life. Second, robbery, the forceful taking of something. Some states will allow, if someone walks up to you and punches you and steals your purse, you are allowed to defend yourself with lethal force, even though the purse taking is not exactly a life-threatening act in and of itself. So what would I do if I were defending Mando here? I would make the argument, as it's suggested here on the screen, that the Razor Crest is his house. I think that's fair. I mean, you don't see him living anywhere else. He's in that ship. That's where he spends most of his time, apparently, when he's not out trying to catch somebody. So I try to make the argument that Jawas effectively were attacking his home, much like the burglary example that I used, and that he was simply using lethal force to defend himself. But here's the problem with that. If you remember episode 2, he wasn't there when the Jawas came and took the parts away from his ship. I mean, of course, they're going to wait for him to leave. He would have disintegrated 20 of them if he tried to do that when he was there. And so because they were stripping parts from his ship, much like stripping parts from his car, I don't then think he can use lethal force to chase these guys down and disintegrate, in his own words, 3 of them. So there is a defense. Jawas are not well liked. So maybe I get some jurors on my side. Maybe I can hang this jury if I'm Mando's lawyer. But from a purely legal standpoint, he has some problems.
I do want to mention that if any, Imperial remnant officers are listening to this presentation, they should be taking notes from Judge Owens.
Moving on to one of my favorite topics is droid rights. And in The Mandalorian, season 1, we see 4 astromechs get summarily executed, and that's disturbing. Whether it's little guy just driving a little cart gets shot by Grief Karga. We have Cara Dune shoot the ferry tender, and again, there's 4 of them that get taken out. And then we have IG-11 and wonderful issues with him. Judge Beckerman, you presided over our fictional droid rights mock trial we did at WonderCon a couple years ago. And I just want to get your thoughts on the droid's rights issue. Is it murder to shoot a droid or destruction of property? Your thoughts?
Josh, it really turns on whether we think the law should treat droids or robots with who have some degree of artificial intelligence more like humans or more like machines. And the current law even of robots or droids turns largely on the intelligence level of the robot or droid. So let me get really geeky with you for a moment here. Thought leaders today seem to agree that before a smart robot or machine can be treated like a person under the law, there has to be a couple of qualities. One of those qualities is that the droid must be equipped with an algorithm that allows it to make morally relevant decisions. The droid would also have to be capable of communicating those decisions to humans and also be permitted to act on its environment without any immediate human supervision. And importantly, a decision is morally relevant if it allows the droid to make a choice between 2 or more actions that might be considered right or wrong by members of the community. So in fact, this personhood for droids is a very timely topic. Academics and legal geeks continue to debate how the law should treat robots or droids for the purposes of criminal law, which is what we're discussing, but also for the purposes of tort law. And it goes both ways, right? So if, in your example, if Din can be charged with the murder of IG because IG is close enough to a person to be considered a crime victim, then the law needs to be consistent and also hold IG criminally responsible when he breaks the law or commits a tort or other bad acts. Currently, I would say that robots or droids are not smart enough to make morally relevant decisions, but scientists continue to work on how to use reinforcement learning to create these more ethical robots. Moving forward in the law, it's a very timely topic. When we're trying to determine the criminal or the tort responsibility of a robot or the worth of a robot as a victim, it's going to become increasingly complex as more sophisticated, autonomous, and self-learning robots are developed. And when they're making decisions on their own that are not traced back to a human, the law is going to continue to evolve. So, in today's world with self-driving cars and Sophia, the conversation robot, or Pepper, the Japanese humanoid robot with feelings, and Starship delivery bots and droid builder clubs, robot law is going to evolve, I think, very quickly, and it is evolving from con to con. But back to your example of IG, who famously said, "I'm not a living thing and I have never been alive." IG was programmed first as an assassin, and he was not smart enough to make a real-time ethical decision not to eliminate the child as he was programmed to do. Therefore, under the law, he was not smart enough to be charged with murder, and therefore not smart enough to be considered a murder victim. So my verdict, destruction of property only.
What about the concept that Quill introduces us to, that droids are a neutral reflection upon those who provide them input, so that they, it's like nature versus nurture type situation, going beyond programming. Does that weigh into your analysis, or is that just part of how smart they are and if they're learning to make ethical decisions?
I think that's consistent with my analysis in that they are neutral. They are being programmed to do X. Your question raises another question, which is whoever programmed IG-11 to eliminate Grogu, should that person be held responsible for the elimination of another? And so right now, I think the law is at a juncture where we are still holding the human responsible for, whoever developed the self-driving car has some responsibility, but not yet the self-driving car. And I think the same applies to droids.
That reminds me of our first appearance at San Diego Comic-Con in 2015, which we did, Tatooine law, and Judge Paul Graywall was on that panel. And a 7-year-old asked him a question about droid manufacturer liability, and he made it sound akin to either suing a gun manufacturer or suing big tobacco, which was one astounding. A 7-year-old came up with that type of analogy and question, and also fortified my love of San Diego Comic-Con and seeing little proto legal geeks throw out those type of questions to a federal judge. And this can go to all three of our judges. How would you sue droid manufacturers and issues that could explode from that for you made an assassin droid that goes around shooting infants because that's what the contract says to do? And Judge Beckerman, thoughts on that?
Well, certainly to program an assassin droid to assassinate somebody, there is an intent to harm, there is an intent to kill, as opposed to maybe a gun manufacturer or a tobacco manufacturer who is maybe putting a bad, unhealthy product that can harm into the commerce stream. A little bit more egregious when you're actually programming the product to go kill someone, especially somebody specific. There is definitely an intent issue there. But I agree with you. The young people of Comic-Con ask the best questions, sometimes the hardest questions, including Judge Owen's children, who have asked some really complicated, thoughtful questions over the years at the cons.
And while we pivot to Judge Owens, have your daughters asked those type of hard questions of you yet?
Yes, my younger one tends to try to stump me on these things. And to get to the heart of this question, I think, in addition to obviously the obstacles of taking on a really big company who manufactures these droids, there's also the doctrine that says if you are a contractor who is building something pursuant to a government directive in a sense, it makes it much harder to sue the government contractor. So for example, there was all kinds of litigation involving military aircraft and military weaponry that perhaps did not function exactly as was intended. It's very hard to sue those companies because they will say, look, we designed it as we were supposed to design it. It's never going to be perfect, but we get essentially immunity. So if IG-11 or IG-88 or any of these droids were manufactured pursuant to a government plan, like the Empire's plan to make death robots to attack the rebel somewhere, I have no idea, it would be even harder because they could point to that doctrine, the federal contractor defense, and make it pretty tough. So I think this is going to be a tough case if these droids were manufactured pursuant to some sort of government directive.
Thank you. Judge Shrino, let's pivot to you on suing Big Droid. And
most of the assassin droids, and at least in the book, some of it non-canon these days, were private contracts, generally as either a bodyguard or for nefarious purposes. So I think that these products are inherently dangerous, and there's a whole separate body of law dealing with manufacturing inherently dangerous products. And I think you can also argue that it's reasonably foreseeable that an assassin droid, when it goes out to kill A, might accidentally kill B and C who happen to have been near A. So I think that you would be able to go after a couple of the big corporate entities that manufactured these droids. And most of them, although some of them were under government contract for battle droids of various times and places, most of the assassin droids were private purchases.
Well, let's pivot to the fun topic of prosecuting war criminals. And Nari, can you help us with that, please?
Yeah, so as we see throughout the Mandalorian, there is some remnant of the Empire actually referred to as the Imperial remnant. And they seem to be operating and existing basically like the Empire is still around. They see themselves clearly as some kind of quasi-government or an actual military force representing some kind of a government. But of course, a lot has changed since the events of the, depicting the actual fall of the Empire and death of the Emperor. And so it raises a very interesting question, which is, what is the Imperial remnant in the Mandalorian? Is it a nation state? Is it a transnational terrorist organization? And answering these questions could matter in the sense that could a planet which has an Imperial remnant on it simply engage in police action to try to quell or detain all of these terrorists sitting on their planet and causing trouble? Or are they a nation state entitled to sit there and defend themselves? So Judge Sharino, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Well, I would say that at least under the Military Commission Act of the United States, that they would be lawful enemy combatants. And a lawful enemy combatant is a member of the regular forces of a state body engaged in hostilities against the United States under that law, so against the Republic. It could also be a member of the militia, a voluntary corps, or an organized resistance movement. And you can make an argument that the Imperial remnant is a organized resistance movement. And also part of that definition is that they are under a command, a chain of command, that they wear a fixed distinctive sign, like this one, recognizable at a distance, that they carry their arms openly, and that they abide by the law of war. Now, arguably, the remnant might not be in particular cases following whatever the law of war is in the galaxy far, far away. But arguably, they do come under the B section of the Military Commission Act of 2006, because the stormtroopers are clearly recognizable. They carry their arms openly, and they are operating as an army. And I think that in order to really flesh this out, we need to look at that actual peace treaty that occurred at the end of the Battle of Jakku, which did cease the hostilities between the rebel alliance and the Empire. And they called that the Galactic Concordance. And the Galactic Concordance was the peace treaty that marked the era of the Galactic Civil War. It was between the then leader of the Empire, which is Mos Amata, which was that big blue guy that you would see behind Emperor Palpatine, generally to his right or to his left. He was the parliamentarian of the Senate for a while. And between he and the Republican Chancellor, Mon Mothma. And Princess Leia was also at the Galactic Concordance, where the peace treaty was signed. And interestingly, as a trivia question, this also marks the birthday for Ben Solo, because right after the treaty was signed, she went into labor and gave birth to Ben. Now, under the terms of the instruments of surrender, the Empire was ordered to cease fighting. It was ordered to disband their military machine. They also, under the terms of the surrender document, classified all surviving Imperial officers who did not adhere to the terms of the surrender as war criminals. So under the terms of the Galactic Concordance itself, it would make the Imperial remnant leaders like the Moff and a war criminal. So he would have a defense in saying that we're operating as an army, but under the actual terms of the surrender itself, he is labeled a war criminal unless he gives up his arms and surrenders. Now, the civilian members of the military were granted conditional pardons, and additionally, all of the Imperial schools had to cease their operations. So that in a nutshell, and there's some more peculiarities as to the terms of the surrender, but under that document itself, I think you can make a very good argument that any of the Imperial officers that did not surrender were war criminals. Their defense would be, we are operating under the laws of war. We are a resistance movement. We are trying to bring back the Empire, and we have the legal right to do so. And that would be their defense, I would say, to being called a war criminal, absent acts.
Judge Serino, if I could add just a little bit to this discussion, because I think, the law of war is one of the fields of law that is perhaps among the least understood by most people, including a lot of lawyers. And you were discussing before, whether or not these Imperial troops who have not laid down their arms qualify as lawful combatants or are, following the laws of war, even though they're engaged in this armed resistance. Can you tell me just a little bit about, what's the importance of that? And I'm thinking in particular of combatants privilege.
Yeah, the importance of it is after the fact. If you lose and you're now a prisoner of war, and there's a Nuremberg-esque trial, unless you have the defenses that show that you are a lawful combatant, you're not a lawful combatant, and then you can be sentenced to enhanced penalties based on basically the victor's rules.
Exactly. So, or I hate to say an ordinary war, but in a regular type of war, when people are abiding by the law of war, you don't have as you just mentioned, the side that captures an enemy soldier, try that soldier under their domestic law for murdering one of their own soldiers, that kind
Correct.
of thing.
If you act, under the lawful, as a lawful combatant, following lawful orders, you can't be held criminally liable for following those orders. Now, we've certainly have seen many cases where people, even though they were lawful combatants themselves, did unlawful acts, whether that's, wiping out a village in Vietnam, or the concentration camps during World War II. Clearly, lawful combatants can be prosecuted for unlawful acts if what they do is deemed to be unlawful. Sometimes after the fact, sometimes it's clear at the time that what they're doing is unlawful. It depends on the situation.
Judge Beckerman, let's talk about not taking off one's helmet. And do we have anything in our jurisprudence that would, support that type of religious belief?
Well, that's interesting, Josh. The first thing that came to mind as we sit here in summer of 2021 is the mask mandates. And can we force people to wear a face covering, or can we force people to remove their face covering? But you raised the more relevant point, which is what happens if you're wearing a face covering because of your religious beliefs? And here, Mando, of course, wears his helmet in reverence to the Mandalorian code. His religious creed prevents him from removing his helmet, according to him. And that's more analogous to perhaps Muslim women who wear a hijab as part of their faith. And there is a lot of law around that. And generally, there are exceptions, but generally the First Amendment protects the right to wear a hijab. And there's case law where people have tried to force women to remove their head coverings. And those cases involve, for example, going through TSA when you have a security check. Generally, the courts have held that you cannot make somebody remove their religious garb unless the alarm sounds, and then it leads to a pat down. And so there are some exceptions, but there's also case law involving border crossing guards or employers, teachers, public accommodations, the DMV, about a woman's right to wear her hijab. And so, generally the law protects the right because it's based on their religious beliefs. But interestingly, again, a timely topic in the past year, it's come up several times with young women who have been arrested during protests, and police have forced them to remove their hijab during booking photos. And there's several cases pending now, actually, where police officers have forced the removal and they have sued as a violation of their civil rights. And very recently, the New York Police Department agreed as part of a settlement of litigation not to force women to remove their hijab. So let me just briefly touch on the face mask requirements, because I think we're all dealing with whether we can be forced to wear a mask or whether I can be forced to remove my mask if I feel like I'm in an unhealthy situation. And of course, there are hundreds of lawsuits on mask mandates that were filed across the country. A lot of those are still pending. A lot of them, thankfully, likely will be moot because mask mandates are ending as COVID numbers go down finally. But most courts have upheld mask mandates as in the interest of public health. So let's get back to the Mandalorian. Can someone force him to remove his helmet? Not force him to wear it, but can they force him to remove it? Again, the couple of examples that come up in the law, or perhaps a TSA check, a booking photo, something like that. One other interesting issue that came up: if the Mandalorian was required to testify in court and somebody was required to see his face, that's actually the subject of current lawsuits during the COVID era as well, because criminal defendants are insisting that witnesses remove their face mask to protect their rights under the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause. The Supreme Court has said that you have a right to confront your accuser or witnesses face to face. And there was one Oregon court actually who insisted that a victim of a crime testify maskless, and she didn't feel safe doing so because she took care of her elderly parents. So she just didn't show up for trial, and all the criminal charges were dismissed. So courts have dealt with that differently. Some require you to testify without a mask, but behind plexiglass and a face shield. Some judges have gotten creative and ordered transparent face masks. So there's a wide range of creative solutions for when the law requires somebody to see your face. For Mando himself, unless he's arrested or a witness in court, The First Amendment should protect his rights of his religious beliefs to wear a helmet. Footnote to this topic, Mando also famously said that weapons are part of my religion. Think about that for a moment. I imagine some Americans might agree, but that would suggest that the First Amendment also protects his right to bear arms, which is an issue I'm not going to.
And Josh, I just, as to just one little cute aside, I think you have the motor vehicle and their driver's license, and you have some cases dealing with, especially the people that worship the flying spaghetti monster, and they want to wear their spaghetti strainer or calendar on their head for their DMV photo. And most of those lawsuits they've been successful, and they have their DMV picture wearing their spaghetti calendar on their head.
I really appreciate you bring that up, Judge Serino. I have a special place in my heart for pastafarians.
You learn something new every day. Since we have a couple minutes here, I want to get fan reactions. So the final episode of season 2, The Rescue, had an iconic character appear. The music that plays during the scenes of his appearance is simply called A Friend. Judge Owens, what was your reaction just to the rescue from a friend?
Well, after being so disappointed by the reintroduction of Luke Skywalker in the movies, Last Jedi, for example, it was kind of nice to see the young old Luke or the old young Luke. I don't know which way you put it, but it was kind of nice to see that version of Luke Skywalker, kind of that, Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker, and not this guy who's, doing this and that kind of stuff in the final movie. So I liked it. Unfortunately, it was spoiled for me. So that was kind of too bad. Yeah, that was too bad, but it wasn't spoiled for my family, and they were all very excited about it. So overall, I was in favor of it. And look, I think The Mandalorian has done a fantastic job, really good job of capturing what was so good in episodes 4, 5, and 6. And my opinion has been lost, and especially the last 2 films. And so it was nice to see it. Had they tried to do that in the films, I probably would have hated it. But because it was in the context of The Mandalorian, which to me is the truest extension of episodes 4, 5, and 6, I liked it.
Thank you. Judge Serino, what was your reaction to Luke saving the day?
Well, unlike Judge Owens, I will never be cool enough to, granted he didn't write the opinion, that was Judge Lee, but he's part of the opinion that has now legally said that those sequel movies are not so good. So my hat off to you. But I think the Mandalorian franchise and a lot of what Disney Plus is doing it really makes all of the other things better. I think that even the prequels, when you view them in light of the Clone Wars cartoon, are better. And I think that the same is going to happen as various gaps are fixed by the subsequent series that we're going to be able to see. They're going to make the sequels better. And just seeing, that green lightsaber light up and just watch Luke go through all of those battle droids on his way to the frightened Moff who was cowered in fear. And I've seen some great memes in the last couple of weeks as to you have to realize that in his mind, he was seeing the person who destroyed 2 Death Stars, killed the Emperor, for all he knows also killed Darth Vader, coming after him. And you really get to understand why he's literally shaking as he appeared on that screen. So I loved it.
Judge Beckerman, did you see it with family? Were you up at 3 a.m. watching on your phone? What was your reaction?
I watched it with my family in our basement, and I know that I shouldn't admit this to a national audience, but I sobbed when he came on the screen. I literally had tears running down my face, and My family made a lot of fun of me, rightly so. I have a very sappy Star Wars soul, and I really reacted to it. I mean, a lot of my love of Star Wars is the history of, dating back to my early childhood. I mean, my whole life I've been a Star Wars fan. So it was unexpected for me. It hadn't been spoiled, and I just had tears running down my face. So, but let me add one more thing with Judge Chirino's mention of judges incorporating, Star Wars into their opinions. I'd like to pose a challenge to my fellow panelists, to Judge Chirino and Judge Owens, for one of you, or maybe one of the judges who are listening to the panel today, to add at the end of an opinion. We usually say, "So ordered," Judge Stacy Beckerman. If anyone dares to end their opinion with "This is the way," or "I have spoken," they'll get a special bonus if you do that before Comic-Con 2022.
Oh, good gracious.
I have to admit to doing it in a couple of oral rulings where I knew that the lawyers in front of me were also Star Wars fans and would appreciate it. I have also done a footnote or two referencing a galaxy far, far away, but I will take the challenge.
Excellent.
So with that, I want to thank our panelists today. I want to thank Nari for helping co-moderate. And everyone, remember, I have spoken.